Hello, my name is Ugorji. I want to welcome you to this special presentation. It's a presentation within the course that is called the Emergency Management and Crisis Communication. It's a course within the Homeland Security Master's Program at the George Washington University. In this presentation, I will compare two emergency events in the United States. The two events that I'm presenting today will be on the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba that took place in 1961, and the other one is the missile crisis in Cuba, that is the Cuban Missile Crisis that took place in 1962. So what is emergency management? Emergency management essentially is the know-how, the skill sets, and the processes that are involved in preparing for and or responding to a crisis. And what is a crisis? A crisis, according to Lawrence Burton, who wrote the book Leadership Crisis Now, crisis is any event that has the potentials of causing serious harm to the people, reputation, and financial conditions of an organization. In this case, the organization that we'll be looking at is the United States of America. Now, with respect to emergency management, Professor John Kavanagh, who is the instructor in this course, that is the Emergency Management and Crisis Communication course, he says that there are three elements to an effective emergency management. The first is leadership, that essentially a competent and credible leadership can go a long way to enabling us to manage crisis, both before, during, and after. And the second part or element to an effective emergency management is what he refers to as the strategic platform. And then the third is essentially the communication plan that is put in place, both to communicate within the organization and between the organization and the rest of the world with respect to what is going on about the crisis and events surrounding the management of the crisis. So according to Professor Kavanagh again, there are four phases in emergency management. The first phase is the mitigation phase, which is also the phase during which the threat is identified and a risk assessment is done to understand the parameters and the potentials of the threat. The second phase is the preparation to either prevent the crisis or to prepare for the crisis if it eventually takes place. Now, the third phase is the response phase. At this time, the crisis has arrived, and now those who are tasked with managing emergencies now begin to respond to the crisis. So this phase deals with the plans that are in place or the implementations of the plans that were developed at the preparation phase. And then the final stage of emergency management is the recovery stage. This is at the stage where the responders and those who are responsible for managing the event or managing the crisis try to get the organization back to some sense of normalcy, return the organization back to some sense of normalcy. Okay, so now let's get to the two events proper. The first event is the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which took place in 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an attempt by the US government essentially to overthrow the new government of Fidel Castro in Cuba. Fidel Castro and his group had come into power in Cuba after some years of guerrilla warfare, and they essentially succeeded in chasing out President Batista, who was a US-backed president of Cuba at the time. And this happened in 1959. And as soon as Castro came into office with his group, he began to show some socialist-leaning tendencies, which included the nationalization of companies. Many of these companies were owned by American business interests. And he also began to establish a close relationship between his government in Cuba and that of the Soviet Union, headed at the time by Premier Khrushchev. So these events or these tendencies of the Castro administration combined to make the American government very uncomfortable, and they saw Cuba, or began to see Cuba, as not good for business, and maybe even as a potential existential threat to the United States. And so just before the 1960 elections in the United States, the CIA, authorized by President Eisenhower at the time, began to put plans together to overthrow Fidel Castro. The U.S., or the agency that was tasked with developing this plan, was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which is a secretive agency by the nature of its work. And they had two options, one, or a combination of the two. The first was to foment an insurrection in Cuba that would happen within the confines or the boundaries of Cuba, that would lead to a popular uprising against the Castro regime. The other option was to organize an outright invasion of Cuba. Now, the principal element here was that the U.S. government did not want to have its fingerprints identified with respect to whatever was going to happen, whether it was an insurrection or an invasion or a combination of both. So they decided to put together a secret plot that involved the recruitment of Cuban nationals, Cuban exiles in Florida and elsewhere in the United States, bring them together, train them, equip them, and eventually to deploy them and support them in the invasion of Cuba. This particular plan did not originate with Kennedy or with Kennedy's people, with Kennedy's lieutenants who came with him to government they were sworn in 1961. But because they shared the belief that Cuba was a strategic interest to the United States, they went along anyway with the idea of removing Castro in Cuba. But the support that Kennedy brought to this activity was tepid at best. And as time went on, some aspects of the event were changed at the last minute. And so, and some of the elements that they needed, the supply and the resources that they needed to carry out an effective invasion in Cuba were not present as part of the effort and part of the plan. In terms of communication, the Americans continued to deny, even when the New York Times had published an expose suggesting that America was recruiting Cuban exiles to go and invade Cuba. The United States, under the leadership of John F. Kennedy, denied any involvement in any such plan. But the fact was that Castro himself and the Cuban government pretty much was aware, due to leaks to the newspapers in America, that there was an invasion being planned. The question was when it would take place and where the invasion would come onto the island. At what point on the island would the invading forces arrive? Now, the original plan had it to take place at a place called Trinidad within the Cuban island, but the John F. Kennedy administration at the last minute changed it to Bay of Pigs. And not only did they change it to Bay of Pigs, they reduced some of the planned supply of equipment that was supposed to take place, that was supposed to be brought to support the invasion. For instance, there was supposed to be 16 aircrafts that would follow the invading force to protect them from the Cuban forces and from Cuban airplanes. Instead of 16, it was reduced to 8. And there was supposed to be a pre-bombing a day or two before the date of the invasion to knock out the airplanes of the Cuban force. That bombing took place, but they used old B-2 bomber planes, which missed a lot of their targets. The result was that the Cuban government was left still with quite a lot of its planes that were used during the operation to sink the ships, some of the ships or vessels of the invading forces, and therefore rendered some of the communication equipments that the forces had with them inoperable because they fell into water, could not communicate with one another. Now, The choice of Bay of Pigs also ceded to the Cuban government territorial advantage in terms of the knowledge of the territory where the invasion was taking place. Supposedly, Castro used to fish in the Bay of Pigs and therefore knew the Bay of Pigs like the back of his hand. So he could maneuver around the Bay of Pigs better than the invading forces could. And so when they ascertained that the forces had landed at the Bay of Pigs, Castro was able to mobilize about 20,000 troops of Cuban forces to move towards the Bay of Pigs and stop the invasion. Now, the second event that I wish to present is what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was just about a year after the Bay of Pigs invasion that failed and failed miserably. The US flew a reconnaissance flight over Cuba and were able to get photographs showing that there were about 3 missile launching sites in the western part of Cuba. Now, that meant that the relationship between the Cuban government and the Soviet Union had gone to the extent where the Soviet Union decided to build and situate missile launching sites and missiles in Cuba proper. Now, once these photographs were taken and brought to the attention of President John F. Kennedy, it became an emergency, it became a crisis, it became an existential threat to the United States. So a plan was put afoot by the President John F. Kennedy to discuss this crisis and to come up with how to deal with it. He established an executive committee. He took charge of the committee. All the information that was provided to the committee, including the capabilities of the missiles themselves, the position or sites of the launching sites, all of that in this case were accurate. And everybody that was in that committee was on the same page as to what they were dealing with. Now, during the discussion stage, there may have been disagreements as to whether to use military strikes to take out the missile sites or to use diplomacy. But at the end of the day, the decision was made by John F. Kennedy to use diplomacy backed by a threat of military action. And what they decided to do was to blockade, to establish a naval blockade of Cuba, preventing all ships, including or especially ships from the Soviet Union, from entering Cuba. To make a long story short, as a result of the back-channel diplomacy and high-stakes diplomacy that took place, the Soviet Union backed down, moved back its ships, and agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles and the missile sites that were in Cuba. In return for that, the United States agreed not to invade Cuba, which was and continued to be the fear of the Castro regime, that the US was eventually going to invade them. That fear perhaps became eliminated only recently in the past year or so when President Barack Obama re-established diplomatic relations with the island nation of Cuba. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved without a shot being fired and without the US and the Soviet Union needing to go to war over that. So we saw in the second event the result of diplomacy and the result of effective leadership, an effective communication plan, an effective strategy in managing the event that took place in 1962.